So in any case, plenty of money was raised both by the Freedmen's Bureau as well as African Americans themselves to support educational institutions for African Americans in the newly emancipated South. The Bureau furnished the buildings, and the former slaves hired, housed, and even fed the teachers who were sent down from the North to teach newly emancipated African American people. Northern churches also established colleges in the South, although mostly they were interested in providing primary and secondary education. But the African Methodist Church and the Freedmen's Bureau established Fisk in Tennessee, Hampton in Virginia, Tougaloo in Alabama, and Avery in South Carolina, colleges which were specifically aimed at improving the lot of recently emancipated African American people. And in many of these schools, educated black people who attended them would eventually go on to become the teachers in these schools themselves, creating the historically black colleges which we still know today. Now, white people in the South were especially hostile to these schools, and in many rural areas they were attacked, even occasionally burned by mobs of whites who really did not want to see African Americans working to get education and to try and get ahead, because of course they saw this as upsetting the traditional racial hierarchies upon which the South was based. Nor was there any integration. These were segregated classrooms. Black people and white people were taught in different schools. Thing of it is, though, this was not immediately a goal for the Black Freedom Movement, precisely because they were more interested in educating their children than in fighting for integration. In the future, the educational awakening amongst African Americans in the South that was brought on by Reconstruction really had tangible results. By 1900, the literacy rate of African American people had climbed to over 50%, and there was a cadre of black leaders in the South who had come up through these schools. So education was one of the areas where the Freedmen's Bureau was very successful. But let's move on to the labor question, where the Freedmen's Bureau had less success. The main intention of sending these Freedmen's Bureau agents to the South was to try and mediate between labor and capital to get cotton being produced again. And there's a fundamental disagreement here about labor. White plantation owners wanted to implement a system of labor as similar to slavery as possible, while black freedmen and women wanted autonomy and their own land. The Freedmen's Bureau was convinced that Southern planters did not understand the nature of free labor, and once they learned this, the problems would resolve. But Southerners were convinced that Northerners didn't understand the quote-unquote character of the Negro, and that black people had to be violently coerced into working. So there's a fundamental misunderstanding here. Southerners don't think that African American people will work of their own accord because of racism and stereotypes engendered by 300 years of slavery and, of course, 300 years of defending slavery. So the Freedmen's Bureau is seeking to instill the Republican values of free labor in African American people, right? That they're going to work hard for a wage, and that working hard for this wage, they will eventually be able to better their condition. But the Freedmen's Bureau is also charged with trying to implement the value of instill the values of free labor in white people in the South, right? Who really don't believe in free labor, who don't think that, wealthy white people should have to work, and think that, manual labor should be reserved for the dregs of society. And, of course, white people in the South were very opposed to granting land to African Americans. See, many of the radical Republicans who were actually pushing for land to be distributed to African Americans, people like Thaddeus Stevens, they came from the most prosperous areas of the North, in the most economically booming sectors of the United States at the time, the Northeast and the so-called burned-over districts of upstate New York, right? Places where people who had their own land had contributed to this market revolution, which we talked about in the first weeks of class, which had greatly expanded the northern economy and lifted them alongside it. Northern farmers who owned land and were able to contribute to this growing market economy were prosperous and successful. And they hoped that Southerners would adopt their system of free labor and ownership of farms. They hoped to show both former slaves and masters that hard work could result in, improving their condition and resulting in material comfort, right? The harder you work, the more likely you are to be successful and to live comfortably. And Northerners thought that the South was extremely wasteful and inefficient with its large estates and widely scattered settlements, and that slavery had actually been an impediment to adopting free labor because it was an inefficient labor system, and Southern plantation owners, as well as Southern African Americans, had never learned the value of free labor, of working hard for yourself to get ahead and to achieve something. This is nearly gospel to Northern Republicans, this idea that everybody, white, black, whatever, should have control over their own labor, and that labor gainfully employed and mixed with the land would result in profits, getting ahead, and ultimately wealth. The belief was that you could only get ahead through hard work. Lincoln, the rail splitter, espoused this free soil ideology as well as anybody else, that the harder you work, the more successful you will be, right? In the South, however, they thought that taking property away would violate sacred property rights. It would make people lazy. So ultimately, they fought very hard against land being distributed to African American people. Nevertheless, some Northerners, like Sherman, as we have seen, and Oliver Howard, who was in charge of the Freedmen's Bureau, did believe that African Americans could not be successful in this new South unless they owned land for themselves. And beginning in July of 1865, Howard issued Circular Number 13, which would put aside 40-acre plots for freedmen. He had intended to divide confiscated and abandoned lands up and rent them to the freemen with the eventual option to purchase them. Now, summer 1865, just months after Appomattox, shortly after the assassination of Lincoln, the Johnson administration returns almost all confiscated land to former owners as part of this amicable presidential reconstruction, which Lincoln, before his death, and Johnson afterward had been trying to restore with the South. They figured that the South would not hold so many grudges against the North if their land was returned to them. So what President Andrew Johnson does is he pardons hundreds and then thousands of former Confederates and restores their lands to them. General Howard has the unfortunate job of telling all the African Americans who he had put land aside for them to rent to own that now they were going to have to return the land to their former owners, the masters of the plantations along the Mississippi River. In South Carolina and Georgia, along the so-called Sherman Reserve, where Sherman had issued Special Field Order Number 15, setting aside 30 miles of land inland from the Atlantic Ocean, stretching from Jacksonville in Florida all the way up to Charleston, all this land had been set aside for black farmers, right? Now, they have the unenviable task of telling all these formerly enslaved African American people that they would have to move off of the so-called Sherman Reserve and return this land to the former owners. And the Sea Islands, where African Americans had cobbled enough money together to try and purchase the land from former masters.